Welcome back to another story that is going to reach right into your chest and rearrange something fundamental about how you understand power, loyalty, and the particular kind of recognition that bypasses every system human beings have ever built to explain why certain people matter. If you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell the kinds of stories on this channel that you will not find anywhere else. The slow burn ones, the ones where the truth reveals itself in layers, where love is not a lightning strike, but a gradual illumination, the kind that starts so quietly you almost miss it, until suddenly you cannot remember what the world looked like before it. And if you have been here before, you already know. Settle in. This one is going to take your breath away. Before we begin, I want you to think about something. Think about a room full of people who have been trained their entire lives to respond only to certain signals: rank, authority, bloodline, command. People, or in this case beings, whose loyalty is institutional, whose obedience is architecture, built into the bones of who they are by centuries of deliberate design. Now imagine something walks into that room that none of those systems were built to account for. Not a challenger, not a threat, just a presence. And every single one of those trained, disciplined, architecturally loyal beings goes quiet in a way they cannot explain. Their bodies know something their minds have not caught up to yet. That is where this story begins. Her name was Seraphine Vale, and she had worked in the Royal Archive of Valdenmere for 6 years without incident, without distinction, and without anyone in the palace's upper halls learning her name, unless they needed something found. This was, by most measures, exactly what she had intended. The archive occupied the northeastern wing of the palace, a sprawling cathedral of shelved knowledge that smelled of aged leather and preservation wax and the particular dusty sweetness of paper that had been carefully maintained across centuries. It was not a glamorous posting. The archivists who worked there were not the kinds of people who attended court functions or appeared in official portraits, or had their names mentioned in the dispatches that traveled between Valdenmere and its allied territories. They were the people who made sure that when someone important needed to know what the third clause of the Halverson Accord actually said, or how many silver weights the crown had paid for border garrison rights in the year of the Red Tide, or which of the shifter clan treaties predated the current monarchical line and therefore technically superseded it, the answer existed in organized, retrievable form within the hour. Seraphine was very good at this. She was, if she was honest with herself, better at it than anyone else currently employed in the archive, and probably better than most people who had held her position in the last several decades. She had a memory that bordered on architectural, a capacity to hold the organizational logic of thousands of documents simultaneously in her mind, so that when she reached for a particular treaty or charter or correspondence record, she did not have to search so much as navigate, moving through the archive the way someone moves through a house they have lived in for years, reaching for the light switch in the dark and finding it without looking. She was also, and this was something she did not think about if she could help it, entirely human in a palace that was approximately 60% staffed by shifters of various kinds, and entirely without noble lineage in a court that treated bloodline as a form of currency. She had no magic. She had no wolf, no beast, no secondary form waiting beneath her skin. She had no ancestral claim to anything beyond a small house in the lower city, and a father who had repaired clocks for a living and taught her, in the years before his death, that the most powerful thing a person could possess was the ability to organize chaos into something a frightened person could use. She had found that lesson more useful than anyone had probably intended it to be. The Palace Guard, formerly titled the Valdenmere Royal Compact Guard, but referred to by everyone including themselves simply as the Pack, was composed of 37 of the most elite wolf shifters in the kingdom. They were chosen not merely for combat ability, though their combat ability was, by all accounts, something that reasonable people did not want to think about in too much detail. They were chosen for temperament, for the particular quality of loyalty that their wolves carried, a loyalty that in wolf shifters of sufficient lineage and discipline was not merely personal, but instinctual, coded into the animal nature, at a level that could not be overridden by bribery or politics or personal grievance. When the pack swore to the crown, they were not making a professional commitment. They were making the kind of commitment that lived in the marrow. Seraphine had worked alongside members of the pack on document retrieval for 3 years before she noticed the thing she was not supposed to notice. It began with Lieutenant Brennan Holt, who was not the kind of person anyone would describe as quietly observant, being more accurately described as a 6'4" wall of disciplined tension, who communicated primarily through the quality of his silences and who had, in the time Seraphine had known him, smiled exactly twice. He had come to the archive on a Tuesday morning in early autumn to retrieve copies of the border garrison deployment records from the last 30 years for a strategic review, and she had helped him locate and compile them. And as she handed over the final stack of documents, she had looked up to find him looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face. Not quite recognition, not quite confusion, but something in between. Like a person who has heard a song they know but cannot place. She had asked if there was something else he needed. He had said no, thank you, and left. But he had paused in the doorway in a way that was not his usual way of moving, and she had filed this observation in the part of her mind where she kept things she did not yet have a category for. The second time it happened was with Captain Yara Thoen, who was the pack's only female captain, and widely regarded as the most frightening person in the palace, regardless of gender or species or rank. Captain Thoen had come for records of the Compact Oath's original language, the pre-revised version that predated the current king's grandfather, because there was an ongoing dispute about whether a particular clause had been altered, and if so by whom and under what authority. And this was exactly the kind of research that made Seraphine's blood sing with quiet excitement, because she had, 2 years prior, catalogued a set of correspondence that she was almost certain contained the answer. She led Captain Thoen through the archive's older section, narrating the organizational logic as she went, and she was partway through explaining how the pre-interregnum documents were cross-indexed when she realized Captain Thoen had stopped walking. She turned to find the captain standing very still, her head slightly tilted in the way that wolf shifters sometimes moved when they were letting their other nature process something, and her eyes had gone very bright and very focused in a way that was not quite human attention and not quite threat assessment, and was something Seraphine did not have a word for. "Captain Thoen," she said carefully. "Are you all right?" "Yes," said Captain Thoen, in a tone that suggested she was less than fully certain of this. "Sorry, She stopped. She looked at Seraphine with that bright, focused expression for one more moment, and then seemed to deliberately collect herself. "Where did you say the pre-interregnum correspondence was indexed?" Seraphine showed her. They found what Captain Thoen needed. But on her way out, Captain Thoen paused in the same doorway Lieutenant Holt had paused in, and looked back, and did not say anything, and then left. Seraphine sat with both incidents for 2 weeks before she mentioned them to anyone, and the person she mentioned them to was Etta Marsh, who was 71 years old and had worked in the archive for longer than Seraphine had been alive, and who had the particular kind of institutional knowledge that was not written down anywhere, because it lived in a person who had been paying attention for half a century. "Have you noticed," Seraphine said carefully, during one of the lunches they shared in the archive's small back office, "that some of the pack members behave strangely when they come here?" Etta looked at her over the rim of her teacup. "Strangely how?" "They stop. They look. Not at documents or shelves or anything in particular. They just—" Seraphine paused, trying to find the right word. "They pause in a way that isn't about me, exactly, but also is. Like they're reacting to something their human side doesn't have language for." Etta was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I've noticed it. You have, for about 4 months." Another pause. "They do it when you're specifically present, Seraphine. I've watched. When other archivists are the only ones in the room, it doesn't happen. When you walk in, it happens." Seraphine thought about this. "That's not good information," she said finally. "No," Etta agreed. "It's probably not. And if you've been listening to this story carefully, friends, you already know that this is the moment where the architecture of everything begins to shift. Because in a court built on bloodlines and power, Being noticed by the pack is never a neutral thing. Hit that like button if you already have a feeling about where this is going. And let's continue. King Cassian Aldrich Valdemir III had been ruling for 11 years, which meant he had been ruling since he was 24, which meant he had spent the majority of his adult life learning that the gap between what people told you and what was actually true was almost always larger than you expected, and almost always more consequential than anyone wanted to admit. He was not, by the standards of rulers in stories like this, a tyrant or a fool or a man whose cruelty had corroded his judgment. He was something more complicated, and in some ways more difficult to write around. He was a competent ruler who had inherited a genuinely complicated situation and had been managing it, carefully and intelligently, for over a decade, and who had therefore developed the particular kind of controlled intensity that comes from being very good at something very hard for a very long time, without anyone fully understanding how hard it actually was. He was 35. He had dark eyes that catalogued everything, and a face that had been called severe by people who did not know him well enough to understand that what they were reading as severity was actually concentration. His wolf was old in the way that royal wolves were old, not in age, but in lineage, carrying weight that had accumulated across generations of bonded service to the kingdom. And it was sometimes, in quiet moments, a heavy thing to carry. He had been told from childhood that this was an honor. He had believed it. He still believed it. But he had also learned, in the years of ruling, that honor and difficulty were not mutually exclusive. The crisis, when it first presented itself, had seemed administrative. 3 members of the pack had reported what they described as disruptions in their secondary nature over the course of 2 months. Not aggressive disruptions. Not a fracturing of loyalty or a surge of violence. Something stranger and in some ways more alarming. A kind of restlessness. A reaching, as if the wolf was orienting itself toward something outside the usual architecture of its loyalties and could not quite locate what that thing was. It was not painful. It was not, as far as they could tell, threatening. It was like a compass needle that had found a second north. Cassian had brought this to Elder Thessaly, who was the oldest living member of the Compact Council, and who had been advising Valdemir royalty since before Cassian's father had taken the throne. Elder Thessaly was 112 years old, and had the kind of eyes that made people feel, uncomfortably, that she was reading something written on the inside of their skull. "Tell me exactly what they describe," she had said, and he had told her, and she had been quiet for a very long time. "The old texts," she said finally, "describe a phenomenon that the scholars of the 3rd century called the resonance recognition. It appears in perhaps a dozen documents across the entire archive, and the references are always oblique because the scribes who recorded it were not entirely certain they believed it was real. What is it? An instinctual acknowledgement," she said, "by wolves of sufficient lineage and bond depth of a person whose spirit is recognized as a legitimate center of authority by the wolf nature, even in the absence of formal power structures. The wolf sees something the human systems cannot measure. It does not happen because of rank or title or magic. It happens because of something the texts describe variously as resonance, or alignment, or in one particularly beautiful translation, the right echo." Cassian had processed this. "You're describing a person the pack's wolves recognize as inherently authoritative. I'm describing a person the pack's wolves recognize as inherently belonging," Elder Thessaly corrected gently. "Authority is a human construct. What the wolves recognize is something older than that. And this is relevant because 3 of your most bonded guard members are currently experiencing navigational disruption, and if the ancient texts are even partially reliable, they are experiencing it because they have been in proximity to such a person. The wolf has found its second north, and if you do not identify who or what is causing this and understand it, the disruption will spread, and it will not remain comfortable." Cassian had authorized a quiet investigation the following morning. He had expected it to take weeks. It took 4 days. Captain Thoen came to him on a Thursday afternoon, and sat across from his desk and said, without preamble, because she was Captain Thoen, and preamble was not her language, "It's the archivist." He looked up from the document he had been reading. "Which archivist?" "Seraphine Vale. She's been in the archive for 6 years. Human, no noble lineage, no secondary nature. And every wolf in the pack who has had extended contact with her has experienced the orientation. Disruption. A pause. Including me. Including Brennan. Including, based on the report I just received this morning, 2 of the senior guard members who went to retrieve documents 3 days ago and have been exhibiting the navigational pull since." Cassian sat with this. "She's human. Completely. And she has no known magical ability. None that anyone has detected. Etta Marsh, who has worked alongside her for years, describes her as remarkably gifted intellectually, but otherwise completely ordinary by every metric anyone in that wing has thought to apply. And yet, Captain Thoen agreed. The silence in the room had a particular quality. Cassian was aware of his own wolf, which had been restless in a low-grade way for the past several weeks, in a manner he had attributed to the ongoing pressure of the crisis, and had not examined more closely. He examined it now, carefully, and found that the restlessness had a direction. That it was not the aimless agitation of a crisis, that it was, in fact, an orientation. He had never been to the archive's northeastern wing. He had no reason to go there. The retrievals were managed by his staff. "Arrange for me to visit the archive," he said. "Officially. I want a tour of the pre-interregnum collection. I want to meet the archivists." Captain Thoen looked at him for a moment. "Including Vale. Especially Vale," he said. "But I want it to look routine. I don't want her to know she's specifically the reason." Captain Thoen nodded. She stood, and then paused, and then said, in a tone that was as close to tentative as she ever got, "Cassian, my wolf has been bowing since the 3rd minute I spent in her company. I want you to be prepared for what that feels like." He had thought he understood what she meant. He had been wrong about the scale of it. The visit was scheduled for the following Monday, framed as part of an ongoing royal review of historical records related to the Compact Oath dispute, which was real, enough that no one questioned it. Cassian arrived with Captain Thoen and 2 additional guard members and a secretary who was there to take notes on anything archivally relevant. And the tour was met by the archive's chief archivist, a serious man named Roderick Hames, who had been in the position for 15 years, and who was visibly, carefully delighted by the attention. Seraphine was in the back. She did not appear for the first 20 minutes of the tour. Cassian watched Hames narrate the FIC organizational system, watched the secretary take notes, watched Captain Thoen and the 2 guard members maintain professional composure with the practiced ease of people who were very good at this. His own wolf was doing something he had not felt it do since he was a child, pulling forward toward something, interested in a way that felt almost eager, which was not a quality he associated with his secondary nature in adulthood. Then the door to the back section opened, and Seraphine Vale walked, and carrying a stack of documents, and stopped when she saw the group. And every wolf in the room went very, very still. Cassian felt it move through him like a deep bell being struck, a resonance that was not sound but was somehow the shape of sound, spreading from some central point outward through his bones. His wolf did not rise aggressively. It did not prepare for anything. It simply settled, in a way it had not settled in 11 years of ruling, and then very slowly and with unmistakable intention, turned toward her and bowed. He kept his face entirely neutral. This took more effort than almost anything he had done in recent memory. Seraphine looked at the group with the expression of someone who has been caught by unexpected company and is rapidly recalibrating. She was not what he had, in some abstract way, been imagining. She was of average height, with dark hair pinned back practically, and ink stains on her left hand, and a way of standing that suggested she was the kind of person who was very comfortable being in a room full of documents and considerably less certain what to do with a king. She was also, and this landed somewhere in his chest with more force than he'd anticipated, obviously trying very hard to determine whether she needed to worry about something without giving away that she was doing this. She was reading the room. She was doing it quickly and accurately. and the accuracy of it was written very faintly in her expression, the slight adjustment around her eyes that said she had clocked the energy in the space and was not entirely sure what to do with it. "Miss Vale," said Hames. "His Majesty is reviewing the pre-interregnum collection. I was hoping you might explain your cross-indexing system as you developed it." She looked at Cassian. Their eyes met, and his wolf performed a movement that he could only describe as a deep, full bow, the kind that was not submission, but recognition, as if it were greeting something it had been waiting to meet for a very long time. He saw something flicker in her face, something small and controlled and quickly suppressed, a reaction to something she could not name but had clearly felt before. "Of course," she said. Her voice was even. "Where would you like to begin?" Oh, friends. That moment, that eye contact, that controlled, mutual recognition of something neither of them had words for yet. If you are not already subscribed to this channel, now is the time, because this story is just getting started, and you are going to want to be here for every single piece of it. What followed was 40 minutes of the most professionally conducted, outwardly unremarkable tour of a historical archive that anyone in attendance would ever be able to describe, and the most internally seismic 40 minutes of Cassian's adult life. Seraphine explained her cross-indexing system with the clarity and precision of someone who had organized these ideas so many times in her own mind that she could narrate them without effort. And the system was, genuinely, extraordinary. She had created a secondary organizational structure that ran parallel to the archive's existing physical arrangement, a relational index that connected documents not merely by date or origin, but by thematic relevance and historical echo, so that if you were looking at the Halverson Accord of 400 years prior, you could navigate, via her index, to all documents that shared its structural logic or responded to its precedents, or had been written in specific awareness of its existence. It was, he realized as she explained it, not just an organizational tool. It was a map of how ideas moved through time. "You built this yourself?" he asked. He had not meant to speak directly. It came out before he could route it through the usual protocols of royal detachment. She looked at him. The slight adjustment around her eyes again, reading him, trying to determine what he actually wanted to know. Over the course of about 3 years, yes. The archive had a functional index, but it was linear. I find relational structures more useful for the kinds of questions people actually bring. The kinds of questions people actually bring. He repeated. What do they bring? Something shifted in her expression. Less professional recalibration, and more something genuine. Usually a problem they need historical precedent for, or a dispute they need documentary evidence to resolve, or sometimes just a piece of information they know exists somewhere and need to find quickly. A small pause. People don't come to the archive because they want to know history. They come because history is going to help them navigate something happening right now. The index needs to be useful for that specific kind of need. He stood there, in the middle of a room full of carefully preserved centuries, and his wolf sat in his chest, like a stone that had finally found level ground, and he thought, she thinks about power, the way a person thinks about it who has had to survive in rooms where they had none. He did not say this. He asked 2 more questions about the indexing system. Professional questions, the kind his secretary could note down. Then the tour continued, and eventually ended. And he thanked Archivist Hames and his team and left. He was in the carriage back to the Central Palace before he said anything. Captain Thoen was sitting across from him, with an expression that was carefully not saying anything. "I understand now," he said, "what you meant about being prepared." "Yes," she said. A pause. Outside the carriage window, the palace gardens moved past in their late autumn arrangement, ordered and beautiful, and nothing like what was happening inside his chest. "She's been here 6 years," he said. 6 years. And no one noticed until the navigational disruptions started. "The wolves noticed," Captain Thoen said, gently correcting him. "We just didn't have language for what we were." Noticing, he thought about the way Seraphine Vale had looked at him. The quick, accurate reading. The controlled suppression of a reaction she had clearly had before. He thought about the ink stains on her hand, He thought about the relational index, 3 years of quiet intellectual labor to make historical knowledge more useful for people with real problems. He thought about what Elder Thessaly had said. Not authority, belonging. I need to understand what she is, he said. Not for the pack. For myself. Captain Thoen looked at him for a moment and said nothing, because she was a person who understood when silence was the most honest response available. He went back to Elder Thessaly that evening. He described what he had felt, with the precision of a person who had learned early that imprecise reporting led to imprecise responses, and he could not afford imprecision in this. Elder Thessaly listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. There are, she said finally, in the oldest layer of the compact oath texts, references to a concept that does not translate well into modern political language. The texts call it the anchor. Not a ruler, not a power. Something more foundational. The wolf lineages of sufficient antiquity understood that legitimate governance required not just authority at the top, but resonance at the center. A living point of genuine recognition that the wolves of the pack could orient toward as something categorically true. Not appointed, not inherited, but recognized. Without it, the compact was a structure built on a foundation that could shift. He processed this. You're saying the compact oath was always designed to require 2 anchors. I'm saying, Elder Thessaly said carefully, that the oldest texts suggest this. And I'm saying that the compact has been functionally incomplete for several generations, and no one noticed because the absence of the second anchor manifests slowly, as a general drift, as a low-level erosion of something that is very hard to name until you are far enough into the erosion that the symptoms become undeniable. The silence in the room was very heavy. And Seraphine Vale is? He began. I do not know what Seraphine Vale is, Elder Thessaly said firmly. I know what the wolves of your pack are telling you she might be. I know that the resonance recognition is real and that it is not arbitrary. I know that the texts describe the anchor as human by necessity, because the anchor cannot also be the structure it supports. And I know that if she is what the wolves think she is, then she has been doing the work of an anchor without knowing it for 6 years, organizing the historical memory of this kingdom's governance, keeping the documentary record of the compact's own evolution alive and navigable, which is a pause, not nothing. He sat with that for a long time after he left her. Let me pause here for a second, friends, because I want you to feel the weight of what Elder Thessaly just said. Seraphine has been, for 6 years, without title, without rank, without anyone telling her it mattered, maintaining the living memory of the compact, tending the record of the very thing her presence is apparently necessary to sustain. If that doesn't make something ache in your chest, I genuinely don't know what to tell you. Drop a comment below if you're already emotionally invested, because we are nowhere near the end of this yet. The second visit to the archive was not framed as a tour. Cassian came alone, which was not a thing he typically did, and he came at the end of the working day, when Hames and most of the other archivists had left, and he found Seraphine Vale at her work table in the back section with 3 ancient documents spread before her and a notation system that she had clearly been developing for so long it had become its own private language. She looked up when she heard him. The reading the room expression arrived immediately, faster this time, and what it read this time included something new, a kind of decision, as if she had been waiting to have to make it, and had been thinking about which direction to go. Your Majesty, she said. She started to stand. Please don't, he said. I came without protocol specifically because I find protocol less useful than honesty in certain situations, and this is one of them. She sat back down. She looked at him steadily. You didn't come the first time. Because of the cross-indexing system. No. You came because of what's been happening with the guard. He was briefly, genuinely surprised. He had not expected her to say it directly. You know about that. I know something is happening. I've watched 4 of your guard members have an experience in this room that their professional discipline barely covers over the course of 2 months. I have also watched Etta Marsh try to decide for 2 months whether to tell me what she's noticed. I filled in the rest. She paused. I don't know what it means, but I know it's about me. He sat down across from her, at the work table, which was also not a thing he typically did, and he said, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without immediately deciding what it means, because I'm not entirely certain what it means myself. She looked at him with those steady eyes that missed very little. All right, he told her. Not everything. Not Elder Thessaly's theories about the anchor, not the depth of his own wolf's response, but the factual core of it. What the pack had been experiencing, what the investigation had found, what the historical texts described as resonance recognition, and the fact that the evidence suggested she was the cause of it. He told it clearly and without decoration, the way he had been telling the truth his entire ruling life, because decorated truths had a way of becoming lies at the edges. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. He watched her think, watched the process of it, the way her eyes moved over the table without seeing it, the small adjustments in her expression as she worked through what he had said. The wolves recognize me, she said finally. As what? As something their nature identifies as legitimate. As something belonging. He paused. The texts don't have precise language for it. The closest translation is something like a right echo. Something shifted in her face at that. Not the quick, controlled adjustment he had seen before, but something deeper, something that had been there before he said it, and had been waiting for those words to land on it. A right echo, she repeated quietly. Yes, she looked at him and said, with the precision of someone who had been in rooms with power her entire adult life, and had learned to ask the questions that mattered. What do you need from me? He had expected a different question. He had expected uncertainty, or fear, or the kind of incredulity that reasonable people deployed when told something that did not fit their understanding of themselves. He had not expected that question. I need to understand what you are, he said. Not what the texts call it, what you actually are. I'm an archivist, she said. I organize records so that the people who govern can access the truth about their own history when they need it. I make sure the memory of how things were decided and why is preserved and navigable. That's what I am. I know, he said. I think that might be exactly the point. The silence that followed was different from the silences in that room that had preceded it. It was not the silence of two strangers performing professional distance. It was the silence of two people who had, without planning for it, arrived at the edge of something and were both looking at it. He left that evening with 3 things. A copy of Seraphine's relational index methodology, which he had asked for and which she had given him, with the careful practicality of someone handing over a tool she trusted would be used properly. A set of questions he had not had the day before, and the wolf-bowing sensation still resonating in his chest, like a sound that hadn't quite finished. The weeks that followed were careful and deliberate, and in retrospect, both of them were building something without admitting to themselves that they were building it. Cassian began coming to the archive with specific questions, real questions, the kind his governance actually required answers to. He was dealing with a renegotiation of the Eastern Border agreements, and there were 3 previous iterations of the agreement in the archive, and Seraphine's relational index connected them to correspondence, council minutes, and economic records that together painted a picture no single document could have provided. He sat across from her at the work table and asked questions and listened to her answer them, and she navigated the archives collection with the ease of someone moving through a space that was genuinely part of her mind, and the quality of her thinking was, session by session, one of the most remarkable things he had encountered in 11 years of encountering remarkable things. She thought in systems. She saw not just the document in front of her, but its relationship to everything adjacent to it. And she communicated those relationships with a clarity that did not simplify them, but made them navigable, the way a good map makes a complex terrain comprehensible without flattening it. She was also, which he had not entirely expected but probably should have, funny in a dry and precise way that emerged only when she was comfortable enough to stop managing her professional presentation, which took longer in his presence than it would have with anyone else, and which he found, privately, worth the patience. She noticed things. She noticed when his questions had a subtext, and she addressed the subtext rather than the surface, not intrusively, but practically, the way someone addresses the actual problem rather than its symptom. She noticed when he was working through something, and gave him space to work without filling the silence unnecessarily. She noticed, and this he registered with a particular quality of attention, when she was about to say something that crossed some line she had drawn for herself about what was appropriate to say to a king, and she recalibrated without making it obvious, but not quite fast enough to hide from someone who was watching carefully. He was watching carefully. He was aware that he was watching carefully. He was not entirely comfortable with how carefully he was watching. His wolf, during these sessions, was the most settled it had been in his adult life, not asleep, not dulled, but deeply, fundamentally at rest, in a way that felt like the opposite of deadness, and more like the specific piece of a thing that is finally in the right place. He had not known his wolf was not at rest until it was, and the contrast was significant enough that he understood, in his body rather than his mind, why his pack had been experiencing navigational disruption. They had felt the pull of something they did not have language for, and had been reaching toward it without knowing what they were reaching for. He at least knew. He was not sure this made it simpler. Meanwhile, from Seraphine's side of the table, things were considerably more complicated, and considerably less acknowledged. She was not a fool. She knew what was happening with the pack. She had known, in some intuitive register, that she did not entirely trust, because it had no rational basis, for longer than she would admit, that something about her presence produced a response in wolf shifters that she could not explain. She had also known, in the same intuitive register, that this response was not a threat, and not a trick, and not the kind of thing she needed to be afraid of. And she had also known that not being afraid of it was not the same as knowing what to do with it. She had spent 6 years being very good at her work, and invisible in every other respect, because she had learned early that visibility in palaces was expensive, and she could not afford it. She had a precise and comprehensive understanding of where her power actually was, which was in her knowledge and her competence, and her ability to produce information that mattered, and she had built her professional life around that. Power carefully, and defended it without drawing attention to the defending. The king coming to the archive was not in her framework. A king who came with genuine questions and listened to the answers with genuine attention, and had a way of sitting across from her that made her wolf-free instincts do something she found extremely inconvenient, was very specifically not in her framework. She was managing it. She was managing it the same way she managed everything that fell outside her categories, carefully and with great precision, keeping it in the part of her mind where she held things she did not yet have a category for. The category arrived, uninvited and inconvenient, on a rainy Wednesday afternoon 6 weeks into the visits, when they had been working for 2 hours on the Eastern Border documents, and she had made a joke, a dry, precise observation about the council minutes from 30 years prior, and the particular quality of political self-interest that remained consistent across generations of governance. And he had laughed. Not the controlled, appropriate response of a king acknowledging a clever remark. An actual laugh, surprised and unguarded. The kind that reaches the eyes. She looked at him in the moment after it and thought, with the clarity of a person who organizes things for a living, "You are in significant trouble." She was correct. She was also, as she sat with this recognition over the following days, aware that trouble of this particular kind was a thing she had never encountered before and did not have a protocol for, and that the absence of protocol was itself information about how deeply it had already reached. She did not say anything. She adjusted her professional presentation very slightly, managed the moments more carefully, gave herself more internal distance from the quality of attention he brought to the room. She was, she told herself, being sensible. Sensible was what she was. The problem with being sensible was that it was visible to someone who was watching carefully. He noticed the slight increase in professional management. He noticed the careful additional distance. He noticed because he had been paying enough attention to recognize the specific quality of her recalibration. And he noticed also that she recalibrated when she had said something genuine, or when he had laughed, or when they had arrived at one of the moments of real intellectual contact that had been accumulating over the weeks, and that the recalibration was always in the direction of less rather than more. He was king of a kingdom. He had spent 11 years managing things carefully. He recognized careful management of something that inconvenienced you from the inside. He did not say anything either. He continued coming to the archive. He continued asking real questions. He continued watching, carefully, and his wolf continued its profound, settled orientation toward her, and the compact's navigational disruptions, according to Captain Thowens. Increasingly relieved reports had entirely ceased across the pack the moment he had begun spending regular time in her presence. The kingdom's structural problem, it appeared, was solving itself. The personal problem was more complex. Pause for a moment here, friends, and I want you to sit with something. Two people. One with all the institutional power in the world, and no rest in his wolf. One with none of the institutional power, and all of the organizational competence and a careful distance. She is built to survive in rooms where she doesn't officially belong. Both of them managing something that neither of them has language for. Both of them aware the other is managing. Neither of them saying it. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Drop it in the comments. Tell me you've been in that room. We are going to continue. The thing that broke the careful management open was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a document. It was a document that Seraphine found on a Thursday afternoon. While conducting a routine preservation review of the archive's oldest physical collection, a category of documents that predated even the cross-indexing system because she had not yet reached them in her cataloging work, and which she had known existed without knowing their specific contents. The document was in a protective case, written on material that was not quite paper, in an ink that did not quite look like ink, in a script that was archaic but readable if you knew the pre-interregnum variant of the court language, which she did. It was called, in translation, the original compact statement. Not the oath, not the governance charter. The statement, which predated both, which appeared to be the foundational articulation of what the compact between the Crown and the Pack was actually for. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a long time. Then she went and found Etta Marsh and said, "I need you to read something and tell me if I am reading it correctly." Etta read it. Etta sat very still for a long time. Then she said, "You are reading it correctly. The compact," Seraphine said carefully, "was never only about the Crown and the Pack. No," Etta said. "It was about three things: the Crown, the Pack, and what the original scribes called the Memoria, which they defined as the living keeper of the compact's own record and history. The person whose understanding of what the compact had been allowed the Crown to understand what it needed to be. Yes, and the document says that without the Memoria, the compact's structure would gradually lose coherence, because the wolves would have nothing to orient their deeper loyalty toward except the Crown itself, which was designed to be supported by their loyalty, rather than to bear the full weight of it. Yes, Etta said, very quietly. Seraphine looked at the document for another long moment. Etta, how long has the archive existed in the form I know it? With a dedicated archivist whose specific function is the preservation and navigation of compact records? Etta was quiet for just a beat too long. The position in its current form has existed for approximately 150 years. Before that, the record-keeping was distributed across the council. And before the navigational disruptions in the Pack started, when was the last time the archive had someone in this role who had been here long enough to develop a genuinely comprehensive understanding of the full collection? Another beat. Your predecessor left after 18 months. The one before her, 4 years. Before that, the position changed hands every few years. A pause. You are, by some margin, the longest-serving dedicated compact archivist in the past century. Seraphine folded her hands on the table and looked at the document that was older than the palace around her and said, "I need to tell the king about this." She did not want to. Not for any of the reasons she had been managing for the past 6 weeks, though. Those reasons had not become smaller. She did not want to because telling the king about this meant stepping forward into a visibility she had spent her entire career avoiding, meant claiming a significance she had no institutional basis for claiming, meant saying, essentially, "I think I am the thing the compact has been missing," which was the kind of sentence that had absolutely no precedent in her professional vocabulary. She did it anyway. She sent a formal request through the appropriate channels for an audience at his convenience on a matter of archival significance. He came to the archive the following morning. She showed him the document. She explained its contents with the same clarity she brought to everything, using the relational index to pull adjacent documents that supported the interpretation, walking him through the historical record the way she always did, fact by fact, connection by connection, making the complex terrain navigable. He read the original. He looked at the supporting documents. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at her and said, "You found this during a routine preservation review?" "Yes." "You weren't looking for it?" "No. You organized this collection." "Most of it." He set the document down. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. The concentrated attention she knew, but with something underneath it that she had not catalogued, something that was not professional assessment and was not the quality. He brought to governance questions and was not, precisely, the careful management she had become familiar with. "Seraphine," he said. Her name in his voice was also something new. "How long have you known that something was happening? With the wolves. With you specifically. She could have managed this. She chose not to. About 4 months before you came to the archive the first time. And you didn't tell anyone. Who would I have told? What would I have said? Something is happening with your guard and I think it's connected to me, but I don't know what it is, and I have no formal standing to bring this kind of concern through any official channel." He was quiet. "I'm human," she said. "I have no secondary nature, no noble lineage, no institutional weight behind anything I might claim. The only power I have ever actually possessed in this palace is my competence in this room. That competence is real, and it is enough for what I do. It is not, however, the kind of thing that grants you access to the king to say something that sounds, on its surface, like a person inventing reasons to be considered important." The quality of his silence had changed again. She was reading it, and she could not quite categorize what she was reading. "Do you believe you're the Memoria?" he asked. She looked at the document. She looked at her hands, one of which had ink on it from the morning's work. She thought about 6 years of this room. 6 years of building the relational index. 6 years of finding the questions that people brought and learning to answer them before they could fully articulate what they needed. 6 years of knowing, in some register, she had never been able to explain to herself that this work mattered in a way that was larger than its administrative function. "Yes," she said, "I think I am. I don't know what to do with that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and his voice was different now too, "What if I told you that my wolf has been bowing in your direction since the moment I walked into this room for the first time, and that in 11 years of ruling I have never felt my secondary nature settle the way it settles when I'm sitting across that table from you?" She looked at him. The reading the room expression was there, but it was also doing something new. It was reading something that was not the room. It was reading him, and whatever it found was making the careful management she had been maintaining quietly, carefully, begin to come apart at the edges. "I would say," she said, "that's significant information." "Yes," he said. "It is. I have a significant amount of it. I've been collecting it since the first time you explained your relational index, and I understood that you'd spent 3 years building a tool to make truth more accessible to people who needed it." He paused. "That is not a small thing to me." She was aware of the document between them on the table, ancient and patient, and apparently containing information that had been waiting for a long time to be found. She was aware of the rain against the archive's high windows, same as the afternoon 6 weeks ago. She was aware of her own carefully maintained distance, the discipline of 6 years, the protection she had built not from fear, but from the accurate assessment of her own resources and position. she was also aware that sometimes the accurate assessment changed. "Cassian," she said, using his name without the title, which was the first time she had done it. He went very still. "I don't know how to navigate this. I have never had a framework for this." "I know," he said. "Neither have I. I have a framework for everything else. I don't have one for." He paused, looking for the right word and not finding it. "This. Then we'll have to build one," she said. "That's generally what I do when I encounter something the existing system doesn't have a category for. I build a new index." Something happened in his face at that. The surprised and unguarded quality she had seen before, and her careful management finished dissolving. And she thought, this is going to be enormously complicated. She was correct. She was also sitting across the table from him with the rain against the windows and the original compact statement between them, completely unwilling to recalibrate away from it. Oh, friends. Oh, that moment. That is everything, isn't it? That is the whole architecture of what's happening between these two people, laid out in the middle of a room full of centuries. If you are not shouting at your screen right now, I don't know what to tell you. Please like this video if you are still breathing, because we have an entire second half of this story to get through. What followed was not a simple flowering. It was not the effortless unfolding of two people who had admitted to themselves what was true and could now proceed directly to its implications. It was because both of them were people who had spent long careers, navigating complex systems with real consequences. A careful and somewhat halting and occasionally very funny negotiation between two very different power positions and two very different frameworks for understanding their own relevance. The first challenge was institutional, which was the kind of challenge both of them knew how to approach. The original compact statement, together with Elder Thessaly's existing research and the PAC's experiential reports, constituted a body of evidence that argued credibly for a formal restructuring of the compact to explicitly recognize the Memoria position and its function. Cassian brought it to the Compact Council. This was not a smooth process. The Compact Council was composed of 7 members of varying degrees of antiquity, political alignment, and willingness to entertain the idea that a century and a half of institutional tradition might have been built on an incomplete foundation. Several of them had been governing, in various capacities, for longer than Seraphine had been alive. They had, to put it gently, a relationship with change. Seraphine presented the documentary evidence herself. Cassian had asked if she was comfortable with this, and she had said, with the precision she brought to everything, "The documents are more persuasive when explained by the person who found and analyzed them. If I'm going to claim this function, I should be able to defend the evidence for it." She presented for 2 hours to 7 council members who ranged from actively interested to visibly skeptical, and she answered every question with the same navigational clarity she brought to the archive, pulling from her comprehensive knowledge of the historical record with the ease of a person moving through familiar terrain. At the end of it, Elder Thessaly, who had been quiet throughout, said, "This is what the original statement called the Memoria function, the capacity to make the compact's own history legible to those who govern it. I think we have just witnessed it." 3 of the council members who had been skeptical shifted. The other 2 required a follow-up session with additional documentary evidence, which Seraphine prepared overnight and presented the following morning. The council vote, 3 weeks after she had found the document, was 5-2 in favor of formally recognizing the Memoria as a distinct function of the compact structure, with the dissenting 2 members filing minority opinions that Seraphine noted with the careful neutrality of someone who would be maintaining those opinions in the historical record for future councils to reference. This was not, as she said to Etta afterward, a personal victory. It was a documentary one. "You know those are the same thing in this case," Etta said. "Yes," Seraphine said, "but it's more useful to the historical record to describe it as documentary." The second challenge was personal, which was the kind of challenge that could not be resolved by documentation, and required instead the considerably more chaotic process of 2 people learning to be honest with each other at the specific speed that honesty could be received. Cassian was direct when he was being a ruler, and considerably less direct when he was being himself, which was a thing that took Seraphine approximately 3 weeks to distinguish from the outside, but which, once she had distinguished it, gave her a map she found very useful. When he spoke with governance, directness, the sentence structure was clear, and the pauses were precise. When he spoke with personal vulnerability, the sentences were slightly longer, and he found specific words more carefully, and the pauses had a different quality, as if he was choosing between 2 possible things to say, and choosing the more exposed one. She started listening for the longer sentences. She started trusting what came in them. He, in turn, had to learn that her professional precision was not emotional distance, or rather that sometimes it was emotional distance, but that the distinction was legible if you knew what to look for. She was precise about things that mattered to her. The precision was not protective coloring. It was the form her care took. When she was precise about something regarding him, it was because it was something she cared about accurately representing. This was, once he understood it, a form of intimacy he had not encountered before and valued considerably. They were not neat about it. There were 2 conversations that went genuinely badly. One about the formal recognition vote and its implications for her position, and one about a decision he had made in the Eastern border negotiations that she had strong documentary grounds for questioning, and both conversations required a follow-up conversation in which things were said more clearly and with better acknowledgement of what the other person had actually been trying to communicate. He apologized for the second one, specifically, without qualification. She received the apology with the same precision she brought to everything, and then said carefully, "I find I don't need you to be infallible. I just need you to be honest." He looked at her for a moment and said, "That I can actually do." "Good," she said. "Then we're going to be fine." The third challenge was the wolves, which was the most straightforward of the 3 because the wolves had, from the beginning, been ahead of everyone else. The pack's response to the formal compact restructuring was not institutional calculation. It was the uncomplicated, deep-settled rightness of their secondary natures, orienting toward what the original statement had described, and finding it exactly where the wolves had known, for months, that it was. Captain Thoen came to Seraphine formally, on behalf of the pack, to present a collective acknowledgement of her role. She did this with a directness and a lack of ceremony that Seraphine recognized as its own form of respect. "We would have known sooner," Captain Thoen said, "if we had had language for it." "That's a problem I understand," Seraphine said. Captain Thoen looked at her for a moment with those bright, focused eyes. "You've been doing this work for 6 years. Yes, you organized the compact's entire historical record. Most of it. Without knowing that's what you were doing." Seraphine considered this. "I knew what I was doing. I just didn't know what it meant." Captain Thoen's expression did something that was the closest Seraphine had seen to warmth from her. "The wolves knew what it meant. We just couldn't say it. The formal compact ceremony acknowledging the restored 3-part structure was not a grand occasion. Cassian had consulted with Seraphine about the form it should take, and she had recommended, with characteristic precision, something that documented the restoration rather than celebrated it, because the celebration was less important than the record. The ceremony was attended by the council, the pack, the senior archive staff including Edda, and several diplomatic representatives from the Allied territories, whose own compact relationships would be affected by the structural change. It was quiet and precise, and the words used were drawn directly from the original statement, with Elder Thessaly's translation. When Seraphine read the Memoria Oath, which she had drafted herself from the historical language with 3 weeks of careful work, she read it with the same steady clarity she brought to everything. She was aware of Cassian to her left, of the pack ranged behind her, of the 37 wolves that had been quietly, patiently orienting toward her for months, doing something she felt rather than heard. A collective settling, a deep and fundamental acknowledgement that had the quality of something coming to rest. She was also aware, in the moment after the oath, of Cassian's hand finding hers in a gesture that was not in the ceremony's protocol and was entirely, unmistakably, personal. She held it. She looked forward. She allowed herself, for the first time in 6 years of careful professional distance, to take up exactly as much space as she actually occupied. My friends, take a breath, because that moment, that hand, that space, that is not the end of the story. It is the hinge. Let us get to the other side of it. If you've been here this long, please subscribe if you haven't already, because stories like this one are what this channel exists for. The months that followed the formal compact restoration were not without difficulty, because the world that had been built around an incomplete structure did not become complete simply because the structure had been formally corrected. There were council members who continued to file objections. There were diplomatic representatives from allied territories who needed the change explained and documented before they would update their own records. There were, within the pack itself, 2 members who had served longest and whose wolves' orientation had been most disrupted, and who required considerable time to simply feel the rightness of what the restoration had accomplished before they could translate that feeling into something they could discuss. Seraphine documented all of it. She documented the objections and the responses to them. She documented the diplomatic communications and the historical precedents she provided to support them. She created a new section of the Relational Index specifically dedicated to the Memoria restoration, which cross-referenced every document involved in the process and would allow any future archivist to reconstruct the full historical and administrative logic of what had happened. She did this work with the same quiet intensity she had brought to everything in this room for 6 years, and it was the same work, and it was also entirely different, because she was no longer doing it in the absence of her own significance. This was, she discovered, a more comfortable thing to be than she had expected. Cassian came to the archive every week now, with real questions, and also without them, which was the more significant category. He came sometimes simply to be in the same room where his wolf was at rest and where Seraphine was at work. And the company they kept in those quiet afternoons had the quality of something that had been building for a long time and was finally being allowed its natural form. He was not always easy to be with. He was demanding in the way that people who have been responsible for large, consequential things for a long time are demanding, held to high standards of precision and honesty that he expected of himself, and therefore expected of everyone, and navigating the moments when this quality applied to something that mattered personally, rather than politically, required the same care as everything else, and was worth the care. He was also, in the private hours, unexpectedly, patient in a way that she had not anticipated, and which she suspected had not been fully available to him before, as if the settled wolf had given him access to a quality of slowness he had not previously been able to find. He listened without anticipating. He asked questions that he actually did not know the answer to. He told her things about governing that were honest rather than strategic, the real texture of it, the weight of the decisions that did not have clean, correct answers, and had to be made anyway. She told him things about the archive that she had never found occasion to say to anyone. Not the organizational methodology, but the experience of it. The particular satisfaction of finding a document that answered a question someone had stopped expecting to have answered. The way the collection felt like a kind of accumulated witness to everything the kingdom had ever tried to figure out. The strange privilege of being the person who knew how to navigate it. They were building, she thought, the relational index of each other. Connection by connection. Adjacency by adjacency. The architecture of genuine knowledge of another person, which could not be indexed in the linear way of formal relationships, but required the relational logic she had always found more honest. The morning of the winter court session, 6 months after the restoration ceremony, she was in the archive when Etta came in with a specific expression that meant something was about to happen. "There's a delegation from the Northern Territories," Etta said. "They've been petitioning for formal recognition of their own compact relationship with the Crown for 3 years. They're here for the winter session." Seraphine looked up from her work. The Northern Territories' relationship predates the current compact structure by almost 2 centuries. Their original agreement was made under the pre-interregnum governance, which is... She stopped. "That's going to be in the collection." No, Etta said. "The King's office sent word this morning that they're hoping the Memoria might be available to assist with the historical documentation of the Northern relationship during the session. It was the first formal request to the Memoria function." the first official use of the roll outside the internal compact structure. Seraphine sat with it for a moment, feeling the specific quality of it, the weight and rightness of it, the thing she had spent 6 years doing without knowing it, being asked for by name. "Tell them I'll be there," she said. She was, as it turned out, extraordinarily useful. The Northern delegation had brought their own records, documents that the Crown's archive had never held, and which told a story that was genuinely different from the Crown's version in ways that were both explicable and important. Seraphine moved between the two collections with the ease she always brought to the work, finding the connections, identifying the discrepancies and their historical causes, constructing the relational picture that allowed both parties to understand where they actually agreed and where the genuine points of difference were. The session that had been expected to take 3 days of negotiation reached a preliminary agreement in 1.5. Afterward, the head of the Northern delegation, a woman of formidable age named Councillor Astra Reen, who had apparently been advocating for this recognition since before Cassian had taken the throne, asked to speak with Seraphine privately. "You found something in our records today," Councillor Reen said. "The correspondence from the second decade of the pre-interregnum period. You recognized its significance immediately. It established the original basis of the relationship," Seraphine said. "Once that was visible, the current disagreement about scope was considerably simpler to resolve." Councillor Reen looked at her with old, thoughtful eyes. "The last person who moved between records the way you do was a woman named Isadora Vale, who served the Northern Territories as a record keeper for 40 years, and died when I was a child. She was extraordinary." Seraphine went very still. "Isadora Vale," she said. "Your family?" Councillor Reen asked, with the gentleness of someone who already suspects they know the answer. She thought of her father, who had repaired clocks and taught her about chaos and organization. She thought of his mother, about whom she knew very little except the name he had, sometimes said with a particular quality of recognition and loss. She thought of what it meant that this quality, this way of moving through records, this specific relationship to the preservation of how things had been decided and why, might not have begun with her at all. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may need to examine the Northern collection in more detail." What she found, over the following 2 weeks, with Councillor Reen's formal permission and Edda's considerable help, was that the Vale line had been providing archival and record-keeping functions in various capacities across several different institutional contexts for generations, without anyone, including the Vales themselves, appearing to understand the pattern. Her great-grandmother Isadora had kept records for the Northern Territories. Her grandfather's brother had been an archivist for a military garrison. Her own father, the clockmaker, had in his later years developed an informal archive of the clock repair. Trade's technical literature that she had thought as a child was simply an eccentricity. The pattern was consistent. The function was consistent. None of them had known that they were doing the same thing. She brought this to Cassian. He listened to all of it, with the patience she had come to rely on. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Your whole family has been doing this. Different versions of it. In different contexts." "Yes. And you ended up here. And I ended up here." She paused. "I want to be careful about how I frame this. I don't think it was fated. I don't think there was an inevitable path that was always going to end with me in this archive. I think my grandfather's brother chose archival work because it suited him, and my father organized things because it was his way of understanding the world, and I came to the archive because I was good at it, and it was available, and I needed work. The pattern doesn't have to be mystical to be real." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had finally allowed herself to understand. "No, it doesn't. But it is real," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She had brought the documents, organized into a coherent sequence, and she placed the final one on the table between them. A letter from Isadora Vale to the Northern Council, written 50 years before Seraphine was born, describing, in the precise language of someone who had been doing this work for decades, why the preservation of how things were decided mattered more than the decisions themselves, because the decisions could be revisited. The record of how they were made could not be. if it was lost. She watched him read it. He set it down. He looked at her. He said, "She would have been very proud of you." She had not been prepared for that sentence. She sat with it for a moment. In the particular way she sat with things that arrived outside her categories, and something that she had been holding carefully for a very long time moved in her chest and settled. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." "Good," he said. "It was meant to." Friends, I need to pause here, because we are near the end of this story, and I want you to feel what is about to happen. This is not the love story of a king and a woman who was discovered to be secretly powerful. This is the love story of two people who have been doing the right work in the right way for a long time, and who found in each other someone who understood what that cost and what it was worth. That is a different kind of love story. That is the kind I want to tell you about every time. Are you with me? We are going to finish. The formal announcement of their intended partnership, when it came the following spring, was handled the way Seraphine would have recommended handling anything of institutional significance, with full documentation, appropriate historical context, and a press of official correspondence that was thorough enough to preempt the most obvious questions. The court's response was, as she had anticipated with the precision of someone who had studied court behavior for 6 years, mixed. There were those who welcomed it, genuinely or strategically or both. There were those who objected on grounds of lineage, which were the most predictable objections, and also the most historically refutable, given that the original compact statement made no provision for noble lineage in the memoria function, and in fact several scholarly interpretations suggested the absence of noble lineage was deliberately structural. She prepared a comprehensive response document that addressed the lineage objections with historical evidence. This was distributed through appropriate channels. It did not satisfy everyone, because comprehensive historical evidence rarely did, but it established the record clearly, and the record was what she was responsible for. The objections that required more care were the political ones, the council members, and allied representatives who were concerned, with some legitimacy, about what the formal partnership meant for the balance of the compact's three-part structure. She understood these concerns. She met with each of them individually, with the patience she had developed for people who needed to understand something complex and were approaching it from a position of reasonable, if incomplete, information. And she walked them through the historical record of what the original compact had envisioned, and why the partnership was not a distortion of the structure, but a fulfillment of it. Most of them came around. 2 did not, and they filed formal objections with the council, which she documented and cross-indexed with the other formal objections from the compact restructuring, and which she noted professionally would provide useful historical context for whoever was navigating this territory in 50 years. Captain Thowen came to her the morning before the formal partnership announcement and said without preamble, because preamble was still not her language, "The pack wants you to know that we recognized you before any of the documents did." Seraphine looked at her. "I know. We would have found language for it eventually. I believe you." Captain Thowen's expression did the warmth-adjacent thing again. "He's steadier than I've ever seen him. Whatever that's worth to you." "It's worth quite a lot," Seraphine said. "You know that." "Yes," Captain Thowen said. "I do." A pause. "You're good for him. You're good for all of us." Seraphine held this for a moment. She thought about what it had cost, all of it. The 6 years of careful invisibility, and the months of careful management, and the enormous, difficult work of stepping forward into her own significance in a room that had not previously assigned her any. She thought about the relational index, and the original compact statement, and her great-grandmother Isadora's letter, and her father's voice explaining that the most powerful thing a person could possess was the ability to organize chaos into something a frightened person could use. "Thank you," she said. "That means something too." Captain Thowen nodded and left, and Seraphine sat for a moment in the archive that was hers, in the work that was hers, in the role that was hers, and always had been, and allowed the full weight of it to be true. The partnership ceremony was quiet and precise, and the words used were, at Seraphine's insistence, drawn from no existing ceremonial template, because no existing template had been designed for this specific structural significance, so she had written it herself, which was exactly the kind of thing the Memoria should probably do. Cassian had read her draft and suggested 2 changes, both of which were good changes, and she had incorporated them and noted in the working document that they were his contributions, because the record should be accurate. During the ceremony, with the winter light through the archive's high windows, where she had asked for it to be held because that was the right location, she said the words she had written, and he said the words she had written for him and the wolves of the pack, ranged behind them in full formal arrangement, performed that collective settling again. The deep and fundamental acknowledgement that did not need words, because it had always been older than words. She held his hand. She held it the way she did everything she actually valued, carefully and precisely, with full attention. The epilogue of this story is not one moment but many, which is how the best epilogues work, and I want to give you several of them. 3 years after the partnership ceremony, the Relational Index reached full coverage of the archive's collection for the first time in its history. Seraphine documented this milestone in the archive's own record with characteristic understatement, noting only that the coverage was now comprehensive and that the Northern collection's integration had been particularly valuable. Cassian came to the archive that evening after she had filed the documentation and said, "You finished it." And she said, "The first version." And he laughed the surprised and unguarded laugh that still, 3 years in, had not become something she expected. And she thought, I would organize every collection in the known world to hear that laugh. 5 years after the partnership ceremony, the Compact Council formally ratified a new educational initiative that Seraphine had proposed and Cassian had championed, establishing archival training programs in the kingdom's 3 major cities, designed to produce not just record keepers, but people who understood the relational function of historical documentation and could serve as navigational resources for local governance. The dissenting council members, predictably, filed objections. They were documented comprehensively. 8 years after the partnership ceremony, a young archivist named Petra Sola came to the Royal Archive from the Third City's training program and was, within 6 months, doing something with the cross-indexing of diplomatic correspondence that Seraphine recognized as the kind of thinking that was going to require an entirely new section of the index. She brought Petra into the core cataloging work and wrote, in the Memoria's official record, a formal assessment of her function that used the old pre-interregnum language for the first time since. The original statement had been written. The record should be accurate. It was. In all of this time, the Pack's wolves remained settled. The compact held. The Eastern Border Agreement was renegotiated twice, on both occasions with full historical documentation of precedent that made the terms significantly clearer than they had been before. The Northern Territory's relationship was formally integrated into the compact structure, with the original pre-interregnum agreement documented as foundational, and Councillor Wren, who had been advocating for this for 3 decades, retired the following year having seen it accomplished. And in the archive's northeastern wing, in the room with the high windows where the winter light came through on certain afternoons at exactly the angle that turned the dust motes golden, Seraphine Vale, Memoria of the Compact, continued the work she had always been doing, building the index of how things were decided and why, making the truth of the kingdom's history navigable for people who needed it, holding in the archive's records the living memory of everything the compact had been and was and would be. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 7th year of the restored 3-part structure, Cassian came to the archive with no questions at all and sat across the work table from her, and his wolf settled immediately in the way it still did, the deep and fundamental rightness of it. And she looked up from her work and looked at him and thought, as she sometimes did, about the first time she had looked up and found him there, and the reading the room expression that had been her only available tool, and the careful management that had been her entire professional discipline. She thought about what her father had taught her, that the most powerful thing a person could possess was the ability to organize chaos into something a frightened person could use. She had built that. She had built it here, in this room, over 7 years and 3 major governance restructurings and 1 comprehensive relational index, and one partnership ceremony that she had written herself, because no existing template was adequate. She had built it from nothing institutional, from the only thing she actually had, which was her own capacity to understand how things connected, and to make that understanding available to people who needed it. She looked at him. He was reading one of the border documents. Not because he needed to, but because he liked to be in this room, and she liked having him in it. And they had never found a reason to apologize for this. "You're not working," she said. "I'm thinking," he said without looking up. "About what?" He set the document down. He looked at her with the concentrated attention and the underneath thing that she knew now and had always known, in some register, from the very beginning. About the fact that my wolf recognized something before I had any framework to understand it, and that the framework was worth building. She thought about this. She thought about indexes and frameworks and the relational logic of things that connect without prior categories for the connection. "Yes," she said. It was. Outside the window, the afternoon light did what it did on certain winter days in Valdenmere, turning everything golden and patient, the kind of light that suggests time is not the enemy of things that matter, but the medium through which they become clear. She went back to her work. He went back to not working. The wolves of the pack, ranged through the palace, were deeply and completely at rest, and in the archive's records, in the memoria's own careful hand, the history of everything continued to be kept. And that, my friends, is where this story lives. Not in the ceremony or the formal recognition or the titles, in the room and the work, and the two people who built a framework for something that had no existing template and found, in the building of it, something neither of them knew they were also building. Thank you for being here for this story. If it reached you, if it settled something or moved something or made you want to sit in a quiet room and think about what you are actually doing and what it means, I want to know. Leave a comment below. Tell me which moment got you. Tell me which character you'll be thinking about tonight. This community is built out of people who take stories seriously. And every comment, every like, every subscription is how you tell me to keep making them. So please, if you haven't subscribed, do it now. Share this with the person in your life who needs a story that takes its time getting to the truth. And we will see you for the next one, which is going to reach into a completely different part of your chest and rearrange something equally important. Until then, the record is kept, the work continues, and the wolves, wherever they are at rest.